Hello, warm welcome. My name is Staffan Julén. I'm working here at the Institute for Future Studies, and I'm also a filmmaker, and I'm head of communications here. And I'm really happy that we could do this and that we have Chesa Boudin here. And I just want to give a brief background about this, because in September, October, we went on a tour with a film that I made called Waiting for Life. This is outside San Quentin, the main gate at San Quentin prison. And those were the people that were on this tour. And we did a lot of, let's see, we had 8 stops with screenings, and we had knowledge sharing, and we had a round talk at Berkeley Law, where Chesa hosted that, chaired that. And actually, I remember after, Jerzy said to me, this is the first time, I think, that I agreed with nearly everything that the speaker says about criminal injustice. No. And we talked a lot after, and we said that we want to find a way to cooperate between Berkeley Law and the Institute for Future Studies. So, and in here is also Jan Jönsson, who said here, he did 36 years ago, he was a director for the play Waiting for Godot at San Quentin. And the film was about two of the cast from that play. And I started to film them when they were released after 32 and 34 years. And we had a screening at San Quentin, and it was quite amazing both for them, who was released 10 years before, and for John to come back and meet and see what happens at San Quentin right now. I hope it will continue. And and then we did a tour in Sweden. So we went to the Swedish Parliament. Here's the Parliament with Twin and Happy. So it was quite mind-blowing for them to be coming from 30 plus years in prison and then sit in the Parliament speaking about this. And we did tour on different institutions. We went to this what's called SIS home, the Swedish, what do you call it? Juvenile justice. So we went there and had screenings for the young criminals there. And so this was a start of what we do here at the Institute. Is we do a lot of interdisciplinary interventions with art and other. So in this case, I cooperated with the Department of Criminology here at the Institute. And so one of the continuation we hope is to find some collaboration with Berkeley Law. And we also, it's called Swedish National Board of Institutions, SISHAM. And we will continue to work together with them too. And so with that I will give the hand over to Jerzy to introduce. I will just tell you also that here's a brochure about the tour we did, and you can take it there.
Thank you, Staffan. Could you put the first picture?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
The microphone. Sorry?
Yeah, here's the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. It's not so. Well, very good to see you here. Welcome. We are very glad to be able to arrange this seminar, and particularly welcome to Chesa and to Amina and to Craig. Oh, no, where is he? Oh, sorry. And of course, all other of you, some are coming from San Francisco, or some are coming from beautiful city of Stockholm. I was part of this adventure when we went this film went around in California and showing the film. And there is a proof I'm with here. Well, I'm a pretty shy person, so that's why. Okay, so why are we doing that? Well, there are many reasons. I mean, one reason, which is pretty obvious, is, of course, that we need this discussion about what do we do with people who killed. I mean, the first impulse is very easy. Lock them in and throw the key. But then they are sitting there year after year, decade after decade, and what then? It was an extremely interesting, important experience for me as the criminologist to meet these people 30, 40 years after the crime. And the one conclusion is pretty obvious. People are not the same people after 40 years. So punishing people, I mean, keeping people in prison forever is just pointless, because you lock one person and you release another person. Okay, some framework maybe about the Swedish situation. You know it very well. Our guests know it very well too, because we are talking about it, so I'm going to be pretty short. We are in total change of our system of justice, criminal system of justice. We are very quick in expanding number of prisoners in Sweden, to start with 3 times. Having the experiences from the United States they did it in 80s. 3 times is not enough. If you start with 3 times, there will be any politician who will dare to say, stop, it's enough. With one exception, by the way, which I heard yesterday, one politician, important politician, is against it. Guess whom? Minister of Finances. And by the way, if you look at the American experiences, it was because of money. It stopped. So I think that this experience from the United States, or particularly from California, when they reach the stop and they discover there is no any more money and it's totally pointless, it's probably very important experience. If you learn it now, if we know it now, we act according to Chesa's, Amina's, Craig's, and other people's experiences, then maybe we don't have to be that stupid Americans were. Because it was total mistake in so many different levels. I mean, keeping people year after year, more prison, more prison, more prison. If you look at the Petra Lund utredning, the latest act from the government, is very much nothing less than United States in 80s. It's exactly the same way of thinking. And I say, maybe we should hope for the Minister of Finances. Rumors are saying that she got very upset. So let's hope. But now, please, Chesa Boudin. He is now at the Berkeley Law, former Attorney General of San Francisco, and one of the people who were involved to stop all this increase of prisoners. Please, Chesa, I'm very happy that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Huge thank you to the hosts for bringing us together, to all of you for coming out. You know, this is my first time visiting Sweden. And when we met in Berkeley in September, I think, October, the whole Swedish delegation promised me that June was the best time to visit Stockholm. And I've loved every day here. People keep telling me I should stay until Saturday. It'll be nice. It is nice. This is a spectacular city. And I hope you all appreciate how lucky you are to call this city home. It's been an absolute joy to visit you. And I just genuinely thank you for the invitation, for the hospitality, and for being so accessible to folks who don't speak the language or know their way around except through Google Maps. So thank you. I'm gonna I'm going to talk today about some topics which are a little bit academic and some which are a little bit personal. And I'm going to confess at the outset that I know very, very little about Swedish politics and the criminal justice system here. I look forward to learning through your questions. I've been learning over these last few days, but I know enough about the history and policies and practices in the United States to hopefully offer some lessons learned and some warnings. I've been impacted by and working in and on the criminal justice system my entire life. I've had the pleasure and the pain of experiencing the criminal justice system from virtually every perspective and angle possible. Except I've never been in jail. I hope to keep it that way. But my parents spent a lot of time in jail from the time I was a baby. My father served 40 years in prison. My mother served 22 years in prison. After law school, I became a public defender, defending people accused of crimes who couldn't afford to pay for their own lawyer, presenting evidence to juries, arguing on their behalf innocence or mitigation in cases where the guilt was obvious. And eventually, as you heard, I became the elected chief law enforcement officer for San Francisco, where my job was to prosecute people who had committed crimes. So over the course of all of these different roles and identities, I've learned a few lessons and I've made some mistakes. So I want to share some of those with you today through the lens of the terminology and concepts that we've been discussing at the Conference on Criminology these last several days. So I want to start with one sort of theory of punishment that is really common and has been talked about for decades in the literature and amongst policymakers. Deterrence, right? We all know that one of the justifications for policing and punishing people who commit crimes is deterrence, right? And the sort of traditional, I'm going to call fear-mongering rhetoric about this issue is essentially as follows. If we don't punish people severely when they violate the rules, then more people will violate the rules, right? And it sort of has a logic to it. It makes sense. And surely it's true up to a point. I mean, if we had no laws and no police and no forms of accountability whatsoever, then yes, some people would perhaps commit more crimes. But there's a problem, a fundamental problem with the logic of deterrence when it leads to the kind of extreme draconian punishment that so defines the United States' approach to criminal justice. I want to give you an example. I mean, first of all, most people in the criminal justice system in the United States are addicted to drugs, mentally ill, or both. And so the notion that they're behaving rationally when they commit a crime and therefore can be rationally deterred by some change in policy, by increasing the punishment, right? It simply is inconsistent with what we know to be the facts on the ground. But there's a second related problem. Even if you assume people are acting rationally, and I want to give you a personal example here. My parents, they served their sentences for a crime they committed when I was 1 year old. They participated in an armed robbery, and 3 people were killed. Now, my parents were not mentally ill. They were not drug addicted. They weren't even poor or desperate. They were motivated by politics, and that's a story for another time. But here's the point. They were both educated at elite universities. They were intelligent. They were rational decision makers who believed they would get away with the crime. People don't commit crimes because they think the punishment is lenient. They commit crimes if they're thinking about their behavior at all, which is a big if, because they think they won't get caught. So what do we actually know if you look at research and science and the literature in criminology? We know that the single most effective deterrent has nothing to do with severity of punishment or length of sentence, but rather certainty of arrest. If people think they will get arrested, they are much less likely to commit crimes. They're not thinking about the punishment and am I going to get convicted? And I'll give you another example that illustrates this, what we call a natural experiment. The United States has tinkered with the machinery of death for far too long, the death penalty, right? State-sanctioned murder still exists. It's what Amina and Craig spend a lot of their time and energy working against, trying to save lives, quite literally, from the state. Now, if deterrence were a valid theory of reducing crime, if it actually worked to prevent crime, then surely the most extreme punishment, death, would be the most effective deterrent. And surely then in jurisdictions with the death penalty, we would see less violent crime, less death-eligible crime than in jurisdictions without it, right? We have roughly half the states have the death penalty and roughly half don't. So we have this brilliant natural experiment. And even better, from a study design standpoint, we have states and the country as a whole at one point in the 1970s that have had the death penalty and then not had the death penalty and then had the death penalty again. So we don't even need to compare across jurisdictions. We can compare within states like New York, states like California, Georgia. And what we see is that the availability and imposition of the death sentence does not, in fact, deter violent crime. It doesn't affect it. There's no meaningful connection between violent crime rates and the death penalty. So that's a real problem if we're justifying these expenditures and these construction of new prisons and increasing length of punishment because of this idea that it's going to prevent crime. So what is another justification we often hear? Well, incapacitation, right? We need to incapacitate people who are dangerous. And surely there's some value, some real need in some cases to take people who are violent and committing a series of violent crimes out of the environments where they're causing harm to themselves and to others. That's real in some cases. We can talk about why and the trauma that leads people to behave that way, the upstream failures in policy and practice that result in people causing harm and committing violent acts. But surely there are some people who we need to incapacitate for some period of time. But what we know when we dig in is that the kinds of sentences that we're imposing are entirely arbitrary and far beyond any legitimate scientific justification for protecting public safety. Here's the other thing we know. If we follow the incapacitation logic to its natural extreme, where do we end up? We end up with a death sentence for everybody who commits a violent crime. I mean, that's right. If you've done it once and you might do it again, then why spend the money to incarcerate people for decades when we can simply kill them? Well, people are laughing because it's a crazy notion, but that is the logical endpoint of incapacitation on the scale that we've experimented with in the United States. But I want to go back to the first point. I want to talk a little bit about just how arbitrary the imposition of sentences are. So, for one thing, you've got vastly different sentences in different jurisdictions, right? Not just between Sweden, like, the maximum sentence for a robbery or a burglary or a murder, vastly different in Sweden than in the United States. Vastly different in California than in Texas or New York. And even within jurisdictions, the laws change almost constantly. So the kind of punishment that we might have imposed for somebody in the 1990s is much different than the one we might impose for somebody today. And if you happen to get arrested and convicted on the wrong side of one of those reforms, the outcome in your case could look nothing like the outcome in someone's case that's resolved the next day. It's arbitrary. It's capricious. It lacks any kind of scientific validity. But we actually have this same level of arbitrariness within the same cases. So I want to give you another personal example. My parents did exactly the same thing. Their role in the crime, their level of culpability. If we talk about punishment being proportional to the harm caused or to the role, the level of guilt, the level of involvement in the crime, right? That's, again, these are concepts we talk a lot about in criminology. Well, we can argue about what a proportionate punishment should be. And in Sweden, it might look different than the United States. We have different values, different norms, etc. Fine. Put that to the side for a second. My parents were both arrested in New York State the same day for the same crime. They played the same role. Neither one of them was armed. Neither one of them was at the scene of the murder of the two police officers. They were both in the getaway car that was waiting a few blocks away, that drove the robbers with their guns and the money to a police checkpoint where the people in the back of the car, the truck, jumped out and shot and killed additional people. Now, it's a horrible crime, devastating, tore a community apart, tore 3 families apart, more than that, in fact, many more than that. My parents did exactly the same thing. They were both in the same place. They were both unarmed. Neither one of them personally hurt anybody. And I'm not making the case here that their sentences were egregiously long. They were. But that's a separate conversation. The point here is, why did my father receive a sentence of 75 years minimum and my mother a sentence of 20 years minimum? How is that justice? We know that the outcome in criminal cases, even with co-defendants accused of the same thing, as in my parents' case, depend on gender and race and the quality of representation that you have. You have a good lawyer, you have a bad lawyer. That's what determines if you have a good expert witness, if you're lucky in all kinds of ways. Not culpability, not public safety or future risk. Those are not the things that actually drive the length of sentence, and therefore incapacitation is besides the point. I want to give you another example from my own experience running San Francisco's criminal justice system during COVID. I was sworn into office, my first role ever as an elected official, in January of 2020. Bad timing. You know, they talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? So I couldn't have predicted, none of us could, what was going to happen. The ways in which COVID would disrupt our lives, our jobs, our public safety trends and needs and demands of the public, perceptions. But I knew enough, unlike so many leaders in the United States today, to listen to doctors and to scientists in the midst of a public health crisis. And so when the medical director of the San Francisco County Jail called me in March of 2020 and said, we have a crisis. When I took office, there were about 1,200 people in the San Francisco County Jail. And she said, if the numbers stay this high, it wasn't over capacity, but she said, if the numbers stay this high, I cannot socially distance. I cannot prevent the spread of the disease. We have dozens of people every day getting arrested and brought to jail. It's what we call churn, short-term incarceration. Arrested, maybe there for 2 days, released, some of them not. And the risk of COVID coming into the jail was very high. In fact, we saw in prisons and jails across the country, San Quentin Prison in California, where you saw a photo of earlier, Marion Prison in Ohio, Cook County Jail in Chicago. These were major vectors for the spread of the disease, not just to incarcerated people, but to correctional staff, sheriff's deputies, medical workers, and the communities that all these people went home to when they were released from custody or at the end of their shifts of work. Dozens of people died because of a failure of criminal justice leaders to listen to medical doctors. Well, I listened, and we didn't have any kind of outbreaks in San Francisco, but I'm not patting myself on the back. I'm setting up an important illustration of just how arbitrary the sentences we impose, even at the low end of the spectrum, are. Right? We've been talking about the death penalty. Now over here, I want to talk about petty theft, stolen cars, drug possession, right? Short periods of incarceration. These are what we call misdemeanors in California, crimes that by definition are eligible for a maximum of 1 year in the county jail. So in our effort to do what the medical chief of the county jail asked, my team went over the list of people in the county jail every day. And we looked at their case and their criminal history and their background, the charges or the conviction. And we worked with social workers and tried to identify people who could safely be released, right? It was our job to think about public safety. And that included preventing the spread of disease, but it also meant not letting people out who were going to go commit new crimes. So we started doing something simple. We started identifying people who had a release date, a sentence with an expiration date, right? They had one more month to serve, one more week to serve, one more day to serve. And we started just nibbling away at the back end of their sentence, resentence them to 1 week less or 1 month less or 2 days less time in custody. Now, we kept track of these people. Almost none of them were rearrested during the time that they would have otherwise been incarcerated. But what it showed me was the terrible, terrible arbitrary power of sentence imposition. I mean, we choose to give somebody 6 months in county jail for stealing a car, or 3 weeks in county jail for stealing clothing from a store. Whatever it is, those numbers are arbitrary. They're not connected in any rational way to public safety. It's just this notion that we're going to incapacitate people for some period of time. Now, what the fearmongers say about incapacitation is these are dangerous people. If they didn't want to do the time, they shouldn't have done the crime. That's what they say all the time, right? But again, we're imposing time that's disconnected, even within the same case, from any rational anchor or starting point. Now, there are other theories of punishment, but rather than continue to talk about punishment, I want to talk about something else that I learned and that we've begun to talk about already, which is decarceration, right? Because it seems so counterintuitive to most of us, even those of us that are opposed to the kind of reforms that are being pushed on Sweden in this moment. It seems counterintuitive to say that decarceration is a path to safety. And maybe in the context of COVID, it makes more sense, right? We can mitigate the spread of a disease. But what about in other contexts? Well, I want to tell you what we did. I mean, certainly the fearmongers will tell you, if you let people out of jail, crime rates will skyrocket. If you reduce sentence lengths, crime will be out of control, right? That we hear that all the time. Some of us even believe it or we're scared of it happening, regardless of our politics and our values. It's ingrained to some extent in our culture and our DNA. Well, during COVID, during my first year in office, we engaged in a massive decarceration campaign. Now, to illustrate, I want to just spend a moment describing the different contexts in which people can be incarcerated in the United States. The three main contexts that I, as the district attorney of San Francisco, had some sort of control over, some sort of authority to impact the number of people who were incarcerated, were our county jail, which is what you might call remand, or mostly pretrial detention or short periods of post-conviction incarceration. That's one of them. As I said, 1,200 people when I started. The other one is our juvenile detention center, where people under the age of 18 are generally incarcerated, both pending trial and often after conviction. And the third one is our state prison system. Now, San Francisco is a relatively small county within the big state of California, and most of the people in state prison come from other counties. There's only a small number of people, about 1,000 when I took office, were in state prison from San Francisco County. But that was another population that I had some control over. Now, I know it's really technical, but there's a reason I'm going into this detail. Because what we did, I mean, look, the easiest way, if you want to reduce the number of people in juvenile hall, is prosecute kids as adults and move them to the adult jail. The easiest way, if you want to reduce the number of people in the adult jail, is send them off to prison, right? But what we did was we decarcerated on a massive level in all three places at once. 75% reduction in the number of kids in our juvenile detention centers' cages. 40% reduction in the number of adults in our county jail from peak to trough in a 6-month period. Over the course of about a year and a half, it was a slower process, about a 25% reduction in the number of people in state prison from San Francisco County. Now, if you believe social media, you're thinking, no wonder San Francisco's not safe. But if you look at the data, about what crime trends did, I'm not talking about data from the office I led, I'm talking about the police department's data. what you see is that violent crime and property crime fell by about 20%, a massive decline during the 2.5 years or so that I was in office, compared with the same time period prior to my administration. That's a historic decline. Now, I'm not taking credit for it. That's not the point. That's not the moral of this story. Things like COVID had a massive impact on crime. We could talk about how it affected crime and the ways in which that was far more influential than anything I could have done. And in fact, this is a critical point. Not because I'm trying to be humble, but because what criminologists know, but what the public and politicians all too often forget conveniently, is that nothing an elected official does has a meaningful impact on short-term crime trends. Just not how the world works. We wish we were that powerful. We wish that talking tough or changing the law would somehow immediately say, oh gosh, I better not shoplift now. I mean, it's not how people think. It's not how the world works. And there's tremendous amounts of literature showing that. So I'm not taking credit for the fact that crime fell by double digits. Macro global factors like wealth and poverty, like investment in education and healthcare, like COVID, are the things that drive those trends in the short term. The reason I'm telling you all this is because it shows that decarcerating can actually help make us safer. And that's counterintuitive. That's not a lesson that most people accept or understand. But let me just tell you briefly why I think that is the case. Because we know, and there's been lots of research on this, that short periods of incarceration in particular are criminogenic. You take somebody who commits a shoplifting or gets in a fight at school or has a traffic collision, and you put them in jail for 2 days or a week or a month. Again, an arbitrary amount of time. Pick your number, right? Because that's what we do essentially. We just pick a number. And then you release them. Now, they might have been raped while they were in jail. Massive epidemic of sexual violence in prison. We don't talk about public safety in terms of the violence that occurs to people while they're incarcerated. We conveniently ignore in all these debates. We ignore that violence, those crimes. They don't count, right? But okay, fine. Let's say we're only worried about free society. You take somebody who just shoplifted some clothes for desperation or out of greed. I don't take your pick. I don't care. And you put them in jail and they get sexually assaulted or they get deprived of their medicine that they need to stay sane, or they lose their housing or their job or custody of their kids, or their car gets towed. Now they can't go to work. You tremendously destabilize somebody's life over what is by definition a minor offense. And then you release them and you expect them to somehow do better. It's not logical. How could they do better? You've just turned their life upside down. You haven't set them up to succeed. You've set them up to fail. And when they do, you ratchet up the punishment. And at the long end, people who serve 5, 10, 20 years, it's even worse. I mean, Dr. Haney spoke yesterday about the kind of damage that we do to people's brains when we incarcerate them for long periods of time. The dehumanization, the destruction literally of neural pathways that allow people to interact as a social creature on this planet with other human beings. We literally destroy their ability to be normal human beings. And then we ask ourselves why in the United States, in the neighborhood of 2/3 of people getting out of prison will be rearrested. It's not a surprise. These are policy choices with very, very real implications for safety. And here's the problem. The people who talk tough are the ones who are doing the most damage to the safety in our communities. And they're the ones who justify their policies in the name of victims, but who care the least about actually helping victims to heal. So I want to save time for questions and a broader discussion, but I want to tell you a couple of other quick stories here. So one of them is about victims' rights. Now, what I saw when I was district attorney was that when victims, not just for me, but for offices across the state of California, when victims wanted a stiffer punishment, the death penalty, most district attorneys, most elected chief law enforcement officers, as I was, would give them press conferences. They would say to the defense attorneys or the judge, we can't be lenient here. We can't show mercy here because the victim wants justice. And we measure justice in the United States in years of incarceration. They didn't say that part. That's the quiet part I'm saying out loud. When victims said, you know what, I want restorative justice. I don't want to participate in this system. Some victims say, I don't think it's legitimate. I don't feel safe. I don't feel comfortable. I don't want to be re-traumatized. Getting on a witness stand and being cross-examined about how I was raped. They didn't get a press conference. They didn't get the outcome in the case that they were asking for. And in fact, the United States, all across the country, has laws that are called material witness statutes. These are laws that allow prosecutors, and they're used all the time, to jail witnesses and victims of crimes, including serious crimes, so that they're available to testify to help secure a conviction. How does that help victims of rape, domestic violence, mothers of young men who've been killed in the streets, to put them in jail? We treat them in our system not like human beings who need to be healed and held. We treat them like pieces of evidence. We treat them like pawns in a political system to help justify unjustifiable policies that never, in any honest conversation about science and evidence and research and best practices, would ever be advanced or implemented. It helps drive racial bias in the system. It helps drive arbitrary and capricious sentencing disparities. And it also traps our culture collectively in a place that we often visit when we watch Westerns. You know, the United States has a long, sad history of hanging people in public squares. That's not what civilized constitutional societies do. Look, we can all understand and relate to victims who are angry. If somebody killed my son, I might want them to be killed too. I don't know. I hope I never have to experience that feeling. I might well want that. But ask yourself the question, is it the role of the state in a democratic constitutional society to act on our most vindictive, angry, individual instincts? And if so, why bother having a so-called system of justice? And why have a system that doesn't invest anything in healing? The victims in my parents' case, they got pretty serious sentences. Most of the people in my parents' case were given 75-year minimum sentences. They didn't have the death penalty in New York at the time. We spend upwards of $70,000 a year to keep somebody in prison in New York. In California, it's much higher. So if you think about the amount of money that was invested by the state in punishment, whether incapacitation, deterrence, retribution, massive amounts of money. The victims in my parents' case didn't have anything to show for that money. They didn't get income replacement for their husbands who were killed. They didn't get therapy from the state. They didn't get opportunities for restorative justice. They didn't get anything other than whatever shallow satisfaction vengeance might have offered. But I want to tell you about one of those victims. I talked about the 3 people who were killed, and I mentioned to you that there were lots of other people harmed. It tore this whole community apart. After the 3 people were killed, the shooters, the people who got out of the truck shooting and killed these 2 police officers, they carjacked a vehicle on the road nearby. So a young woman and her mother were in the car. And these people at gunpoint stopped the car and pulled the young woman who was driving out of the car, threw her to the ground, and drove off with her mother still in the car. Now, as a prosecutor, which I was for several years in San Francisco, I would call that carjacking and kidnapping. Those are very serious crimes, especially when there's what we call personal use of a firearm. You can spend the rest of your life in prison for that in California. Very serious crimes, traumatizing to the victims, horrific to have to experience something like that, especially when there's 2 dead police officers on the street next to where you're carjacked. The woman who was driving the car testified at trial against my father. She helped secure a conviction. She helped get the state to impose this 75-year sentence. About 10 years later, she decides that she wants to start volunteering at her local prison. Now, it just so happens that the only maximum security prison for women in all of New York State is in a very wealthy suburb of New York City. It's in an affluent community. Lots of women especially volunteer in this women's prison. And when she started volunteering there, she told the authorities, of course, that my mother was incarcerated there and that she testified at trial against my father, and she made sure the authorities knew, but they didn't tell my mom. My mom had never seen her, never met her. She didn't testify against my mother. It was years later. And they got to know each other because my mother was active in the prison, in literacy and doing AIDS education and parenting classes for other incarcerated women. My mother was busy, productive. She earned her master's degree while she was in prison. And they built a relationship with this woman, Norma, knowing exactly who my mother was, and my mother having no idea. Eventually, after years of friendship and partnership in helping to support other women, Norma told my mother who she was. It deepened immeasurably their friendship and their relationship, as you'd expect. And it did more to help my mother appreciate the harm that she had caused by participating in that tragic crime than any number of years of additional punishment could have possibly done. But more than just that, it did more for Norma than the 75-year sentence that the judge handed down to him, thanks in part to her testimony. How do I know that? Because Norma went to visit my dad in prison too. She wanted to meet him. And she wrote a letter to the governor urging the governor to reduce his sentence after all those decades had passed. We know that there are better ways to keep our communities safe than to simply build more prisons, than to simply say crime's rising, which, by the way, it's not actually in most categories, in most places. It's at near record lows. But to say crime's rising, therefore we're going to have harsher punishments, it doesn't even make logical sense. No criminologist would tell you that's an effective way to reduce crime, unless you incarcerate everybody. That's not what a free society looks like. That's not our values. And I just want to end by saying that for my entire life, visiting prisons, thinking about the impact of incarceration on children, like myself who grew up visiting their parents in prison, thinking about the ways in which our overinvestment in jails and prisons starve local communities of the things that make us truly safe. Right? In the United States, we don't have a social safety net the way that you do in this country. We don't have access to health care. Our jails are the largest providers of mental health services in the country. Right? We don't have, I have a 3-year-old son. We pay more than $20,000 a year for him to get child care. We don't provide child care for people. We don't provide access to drug treatment for people who are addicted. And part of the reason we can't is because we're too busy investing in jails and prisons. California is going to spend this year, I think, $17 billion. That's a lot of krona on our prison system. That doesn't even count the jails. That doesn't even count the criminal courts or the police. That's just the prison system in one state. So of course we don't have money to pay for universal, free early childhood education. Of course we don't have treatment on demand for people suffering from substance use disorders, addiction. Of course we don't have the kinds of things that we know make our communities safe, the kinds of things that make Stockholm such a wonderful city to walk around, even for somebody like me, who's obviously looking at my phone, who obviously is a tourist and a foreigner, who doesn't know where I am. It's a safe city because you all have made the investment over decades in a basic social safety net. This is not the time to follow the example of the United States with Trump in office. So, growing up, as I started doing work on criminal justice advocacy and reform, I looked to Scandinavia as a beacon of hope. This is my first time in Sweden, and I don't want to leave disappointed in the direction that this country's headed. So I ask all of you, to the extent you have a role, a say, a vote, we need hope right now more than ever. You have been that hope. Please continue to be that hope for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chesa. As always, I'm so touched by your describing the both personal and general situation according to criminality that I have hard to say something wise about it. Well, I have only one point, which you mentioned, but just to be very, very clear, because this is not exactly the most clear thing for the people who are not in the business of criminology. This is called age crime curve. It's invented in 17th century, I think, or something like that, which means that propensity to commit crimes is getting very quickly down after the 15, 20 years of age. So in relation to the incapacitation, the idea which is extremely popular among our politicians, that if you give people 2 more years imprisonment or 10 more years imprisonment, you keep them out of the streets because they can't commit the crime. Wonderful idea. The problem is that every next year of incapacitation is giving less reduction of the crime than the year before. And if you look at these people, these 2 guys, our murderers, having a stick, both of them, what kind of criminals they are able to be? I mean, they can't walk properly. They are tired, they are limping, they are again totally different people than people who killed 30, 40 years ago. So the point is that absolutely right, because as it said, very, very, very exact, incapacitation is the solution. But you can't incapacitate people for many years because you don't gain anything from it. After 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So this is a very important point. Is solution for some time, maybe, and then it's finished. Sorry, I just had to make this clarification.
No, it's a critically important point. And look, it is true that young men in particular, in their teens and 20s, are more likely statistically to commit crimes and to commit violent crimes. And so there's a logic, if you follow it to its extreme, that we should lock up all young men until they're in their 30s. Right? I mean, so we don't want to live in that society. I don't want that to happen to my son. I'm glad it didn't happen to me. There are people who would have said, your parents are murderers. You're a risk. You're a risk. We should lock you up preemptively. It turns out I went to Yale. I was a Rhodes Scholar. I was elected to public office because there was an investment in my potential, not an obsession with the risk. Now, it's true that for some people, a sentence of 5 years or 10 years can be the kind of disruption of a violent path that is necessary. And we should do the work to create alternatives to that. We should be proactive about finding better solutions. But for some small number of people, that may be the best we can offer today. But it's a small number of people. And I want you to all just think for one moment. There's people of all ages in the room. I mean, there's people who are in their 70s or 80s. There's people who are in their teens and 20s here. I want you to all just take a moment and think about who you were in 2015, 10 years ago. Who were you? What were your values? What were your fears and hopes? Every one of us was a different person in fundamental ways than the one that we are today. And that's true for everybody. So it doesn't mean that we should never, ever have sentences longer than 10 years or that there's, the point isn't some arbitrary limit. The point is to be intentional about the kinds of sentences and punishments we impose and to have them be rationally connected to legitimate public policy needs. And they're not right now. And they're moving in the wrong direction in this country.
Thank you very much, Chesa. Now we are going to present to you 3 more wonderful people who are here. Extremely interesting and important for us. So Craig Hanem, please come forward. Amina Azar and Camilla.
Does that have to share?
Well, this is not extremely well planned. We just felt that it's not necessary do very much planning if you have this kind of people. So I would like to ask you for, maybe 5 minutes or something, presentation of your thing. We are already presented. And then we are planning to have some kind of discussion between us and particularly between us and the public. So please, Camilla, could you start saying who you are?
Yes, Camilla Salazar. I work at Fryshuset. I'm a criminologist, and I've been working there for 20 years this year, and especially with youth and preventing them, or even more than that, to end up in gangs, but also in criminality. You want me to do like 5 minutes, or just the presentation?
3 minutes.
3 minutes.
How much you feel? Not more than 5, though.
Okay. So this is super interesting because we are in such a difficult situation in Sweden. I think that we are passing policies and laws that are not in balance, or that doesn't have anything to do with the research. And also because it's politics that have a narrative of fear, and a narrative of fear that I can understand if you haven't been close to gang members or in that context. It's very scary, but that's why there are people that know about this. and I think, like you were saying, there are a lot of the kids that we meet, and we have different programs to kids that are in gangs. A lot of the kids are victims themselves, and we have difficulties in understanding that they can be both victims and perpetrators. And I think that's one main thing. And the other thing is that we live in such different realities, especially the youth and everybody else, I was going to say, but with the digitalization, with the quickness of that, it's like sometimes I think it's like a highway, and you put like a playground in the middle of the highway, and there's nothing to protect them from that. And then when they get hurt or try to survive that, we punish them. And so there are logics that are, just like you said, we're not the same that we were 5 years ago, and we're definitely not the same as when we were teenagers. But we keep on thinking that the logic is from our perspectives where we are right now. And I think that's one of the main things we're constantly doing wrong. And I think we are creating a very unfair world where we also individualize and we don't see the context of it all. It's like everything came from like it just appeared from nowhere. We don't see our own role, our own responsibility. And we are right now blaming the kids and saying it's the kids' fault. They are the ones that are doing things wrong, and we have no responsibility but to punish them. Yeah.
Thank you, Camilla.
You're welcome.
Please, Amina.
My name is Amina. I work as an investigator for the federal defenders in California. My job is to reinvestigate cases for people that have been condemned to death. And it's hard to follow Camilla because she is truly a hero of mine. If there were more people like Camilla in the world, my job would not be necessary. My clients, whether they are innocent or not, they have all experienced abject poverty, and they have long histories of trauma, and live in communities where there's no access to healthcare, mental health, poor education, and that combination, that horrible, sorry, it was a rough night. I'm very tired. Just the experience overall puts these people in a situation of a downward spiral. And when I come into a case, my clients have already served about 20 to 25 years on death row. There's a lot of distrust in the system. They don't trust investigators. They don't trust attorneys. And we rely on experts like Dr. Haney to help us put their life in perspective and present the judge with a new picture of our clients. Thank you.
Thank you, Amina. Please, Craig. I think it's on.
So is it on? Okay. I guess I'm here to provide you with the long view for maybe obvious reasons. I have been doing work on injustice in the U.S. justice system for 5 or so decades. And that trajectory started in 1971. I was a second-year graduate student, and Philip Zimbardo and Curtis Banks and I conducted what came to be known as the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Oh.
And I watched a group of college students, psychologically healthy college students, who were selected because of their psychological health and resiliency, randomly assigned to be guards of prisoners, placed in the basement of the psychology department building for a study that we thought would last for 2 weeks. And I watched things spin wildly out of control, guards becoming sadistic, student guards becoming sadistic, student prisoners breaking down emotionally. Study was so dramatic in its outcome, results, consequences, we ended it in 6 days. As a second-year graduate student, I thought that what I learned in that study would help me in what was clear to me at that time, in 1971, be part of a trajectory that the United States was currently on, reducing incarceration. And I thought my job as a graduate student, eventually a PhD professor of psychology, would be to assist in teaching the country the lessons of the Stanford Prison Experiment to reduce incarceration. Now, if you know anything about the dates of mass incarceration, you know I could not have been more wrong. That beginning, shortly after I got my PhD, the United States didn't reduce incarceration. It went in exactly the opposite direction. So instead of devoting my life, my professional life, to reducing incarceration, I devoted my professional life to studying what happens when you punish people severely, to be not only a researcher, but to be active in the process of trying to fight against mass incarceration. Ended up spending a lot of my professional life studying the extremes of punishment. So a lot of my work is on capital punishment. There was a picture of San Quentin up here a while ago, and San Quentin has become a place of restorative justice, of healing, of rehabilitation. I know it as a place of evil. I had clients there on death row, many clients on death row. The first person executed in the modern era of the death penalty in California, a man named Robert Alton Harris, was executed in 1992. He was my client. And Robert asked me to witness his execution. And I watched him suffocated to death in a gas chamber in that institution. That's how far it can go when you start down the road that some people have said your country is beginning to go down. You don't have the death penalty, and thank God for that. But you're talking about the road to mass incarceration. Jersey said something really profound in the very beginning, and I just want to re-emphasize what he said. When politicians start amping up punishment, it's a one-way ratchet.
Yeah.
There's no turning back. I watched this happen in the United States. I watched more and more people incarcerated for longer and longer periods of time, and then I began to study even a more extreme punishment, solitary confinement. We weren't satisfied just putting people in prison and leaving them for very long periods of time. We devised supermax prisons, where people were deprived of any form of social contact with other human beings, where nothing good could possibly happen to somebody alone in a cell the size of a parking space, no contact with other human beings, no opportunity to touch another person with affection, leaving them there for years, and in some instances for decades. There's still 80 to 100,000 people in the United States who are in solitary confinement. When you start to go down that road, it is exceedingly difficult to turn back. And the best way to prevent these worst case scenarios is not to begin that process at all. And I hope that's within your grasp to resist it and to prevent it.
Thank you very much, Craig. I didn't know you were with the Zimbardo experiment. This is one of the, I would say, two most important psychological experiments during since the Second World War. So if you guys don't know what Zimbardo experiment was. Who knows what it was? But I would, it's about the half. I would very much like you to very shortly describe, because this is so extremely important.
Well, so the concept was a simple one, really. We wanted to try to understand whether what happens in prison because of the kind of people who work there, or the kind of people who are sent there, or does it happen because of the nature of the environment that's created? And so one way to study that is to try to control for the personalities of the people who are either guards or prisoners. And how do you do that? Well, it's very difficult to do in real life, so we did an experiment. So we carefully selected people who volunteered to be in the study, and we gave them a battery of psychological tests. Curtis Banks and I were the graduate students. We did most of the heavy lifting, administered the test, did the screening and interviews. We picked the 20 most normal, healthy, resilient people out of 75 people who volunteered to be in the study. And they were healthy, young college students, totally normal. And then we randomly, literally with a flip of the coin, Banks and I flipped coins, half of them became guards, half of them became prisoners. We gave them some of the accoutrements of prisoners and guards. We gave them uniforms, appropriate uniforms. We created a prison-like environment in the basement of the psychology department, within the limits of what we could create in a hallway in a psychology department. We took the conventional doors off, put bar doors on them, put cots in the rooms, and so on. We allowed the guards a day ahead of time to devise their own rules. We said, we only have one instruction for you. We don't want there to be any physical violence. You can't mistreat these guys. But otherwise, be a guard. And then Zimbardo and Banks and I sat back and watched what happened. The idea being whatever happened was not going to be because of who we put in this environment. It was going to be because of the nature of the environment itself. We thought, and I'll just tell you this, maybe it's an expression of how naive we were, but we honestly thought this, that there would be changes taking place. We thought it was a negative environment that we created. We thought it would take 2 weeks for those changes to really manifest themselves. And we thought they would be relatively subtle. So my job as the senior graduate student in the study was to collect the data after the study was over that we would use then to identify what kinds of relatively subtle changes had taken place over time. Why relatively subtle? Well, this wasn't a real prison. The guards had no real legal authority over their prisoners. The prisoners knew they had done nothing wrong. They knew at the very worst, they were going to stay for 2 weeks. So it was a pale comparison of what a real prison sentence is like. And so we thought maybe nothing will happen. Certainly never that overnight this place would become an environment in which otherwise normal, healthy kids who I'd interviewed the week before, they were happy-go-lucky college students on the streets of Palo Alto, were abusing other happy-go-lucky college students in the name of being prison guards. When we decided to end the study, the guards were so deeply into their role that they were upset that we were ending the study. They didn't want it to end because they thought what they were doing was appropriate and right and correct, even though they knew that the other kids, the kids who were dressed like prisoners, had done nothing wrong. That's how powerful obviously the meaning of the study, if you will, is what can happen when you put a group of people in control, almost total control, over a group of derogated others. That's the essence of imprisonment. Exactly. And the prison experiment really is the core dynamic. That's reduced to its minimum. In a basement of a psychology department, that core dynamic takes over. And if it takes over there, it surely takes over in real prison institutions. That really has been, the lesson of most of my professional life is really studying what happens to people in real prison environments, not simulated prison environments. And how, for all the reasons that Chase has talked about, when you begin to think of prison as the solution, you are ignoring what the costs of that solution are, and also you're ignoring its limitations. And that's the cautionary tale.
Thank you very much. Our problem is that our ethical committees probably wouldn't allow us to do this. Okay. Now, before thanking the audience and the panel, I will make some advertisement for another people who are promoting me. We just finished the 20th Stockholm Criminology Symposium, giving the prize to the best criminologists of the world, and this publication is published as the kind of summary of our 20 years. So you have here both description of the prize, people involved, and also descriptions of the all 34 prize winners over these 20 years. So I will give this book to Institute for Future Studies as the present, and I will inform all of you that at the web, if you go on the, oh my goodness, Stockholm's Criminology, thank you. Stockholm, you're absolutely right. Camilla is younger than I am.
Criminology.org.
Okay, Stockholm's Prize in Criminology.org. As the one word, .org. Then you get all this information and much more because we have links to all the winners. And I would just say that this 20 years of experience of Stockholm's Prize in Criminology is giving quite a lot of answers to the questions we are talking about today. Among others, all these people who are explaining to you what's West to do and what is not. Okay. Thank you, guys. You're wonderful.
Thank you.